April 15, 1945. Europe's war was lurching towards its savage end. Yet, for countless souls caught amidst the wreckage, the distinction between cessation and mere survival remained achingly blurred. Within a crudely fenced enclosure near a battle-scarred town on the Rhine, lines of exhausted German women moved, their forms emaciated by years of relentless hunger. Their attire consisted of little more than threadbare remnants that once vaguely resembled uniforms or common farm garments. A damp wind carried the acrid scent of smoke from nearby ruins across the compound, blending with a new, perplexing odor. It was an aroma so utterly alien and unexpected that the women exchanged wary, uncertain glances. Warm, savory, almost sweet, it provoked a spasm in their empty stomachs more violent than any artillery barrage. A young woman, barely 20 years old, rasped to her companion, her voice raw and hoarse from thirst. "If they starve us, it will be no worse than home." This was a statement not of defiance, but of grim resignation. For months, her sustenance had been watery turnip stew and black bread often flecked with sawdust. At night, her dreams were not of peace, but of bread substantial enough to feel weighty in her palm. Around her, other women nodded in silent, grim understanding. They had long accepted captivity as a form of inevitable punishment, convinced that their American captors, whose faces they knew only from propaganda posters twisting features into grotesque caricatures, would surely enact their vengeance through prolonged hunger or calculated neglect. The guards moved with measured, almost detached efficiency, their crisp khaki uniforms standing in stark contrast to the muted gray of the women's worn clothing. Then, with an air of almost unsettling nonchalance, one soldier carried a battered pot to a rough-hewn table and began ladling steaming portions onto awaiting tin plates. Another opened a crate, pulling out loaves of pale, impossibly soft bread, a stark departure from the hard, dark crusts the women had gnawed on back in Germany. A third soldier poured a dark, steaming liquid from a battered urn into chipped enamel mugs. The women collectively froze. They had anticipated whips or harsh, shouted commands, not food that evoked such overwhelming sensations of warmth and home. For a long, agonizing moment, no one dared to step forward. Suspicion, deeply ingrained, clung to them more tightly even than their gnawing hunger. Nazi officials had relentlessly broadcast warnings of American barbarity, depicting the enemy as cruel tormentors who would humiliate, starve, and ultimately destroy them. But the relentless, primal claw of hunger proved stronger than fear. One by one, tentative hands began to reach out. The first mouthful was taken with agonizing hesitation. The same young woman who had earlier spoken of starvation lifted a piece of the soft bread to her lips. It was impossibly white, exquisitely soft, almost yielding to the touch. A golden sheen of butter melted enticingly across its surface. She chewed, and tears, hot and unstoppable, immediately welled in her eyes. Between choked sobs, she whispered words that would echo through years of collective memory. "This is the best food I've ever had." The entire camp seemed to subtly shift, profoundly altered by that single sentence. A profound quiet descended, a silence born not of absence or fear, but of sudden, overwhelming revelation. Women who had grown accustomed to gnawing on crusts of famine bread now found themselves holding slices of incredible softness. Those who had spooned thin, bitter soups now tasted the rich flavors of meat, salt, and fat, the very elements of life itself. The coffee, though bitter and black, felt like liquid sunlight, its warmth spreading through hands and throats long numbed by the relentless cold. They drank greedily, their chipped mugs clattering as if their very bones cried out to be replenished. For the American soldiers, this was mere routine. The GIs had subsisted on these same rations for months, and most of them considered spam an abomination, joking in letters home that they would never willingly touch it again once the war ended. To the women across the wire, however, it was a feast almost beyond imagination. The irony of the situation was almost darkly comic. The very food the Americans despised represented salvation to these prisoners. A soldier smirked as he watched a gaunt young woman meticulously lick her plate clean, then muttered to his comrade, "Guess Spam has its fans after all." The remark was tossed off lightly, a casual observation, but it inadvertently revealed a truth far deeper than humor. Nourishment, it became clear, was profoundly relative. Survival was measured not by palatable taste, but by stark contrast to absolute deprivation. Yet, a deep-seated suspicion lingered. Some women whispered that this might be a cunning trick, that poison would surely follow this unexpected kindness, or that the Americans were merely softening them up for some even crueler blow. But the next day and the day after that, the bread arrived once more. The coffee was poured again. Hunger, in its relentless way, eroded distrust far faster than any speech could have done. Soon, the women queued without hesitation, their eyes fixed intently on the steam rising from the pots, their bodies trembling not from fear, but from a burgeoning anticipation. Beyond the camp's wire, Germany itself was disintegrating. Cities lay in monumental rubble, transport lines were utterly severed, and in countless places, civilians desperately scoured fields for stinging nettles or dug into the frozen soil for half-rotted potatoes. Inside the camp, however, women who had braced for starvation were instead eating better than they had in years, perhaps even a decade. The irony of the situation was a bitter pill, burning as much as it offered comfort. They had once believed themselves part of a mighty Reich, destined to dominate Europe for 1,000 years. Yet here they were, defeated, despised, and now being sustained by the very men their propaganda had depicted as inhuman monsters. The meals rapidly transcended mere sustenance, becoming a profound revelation. Each spoonful chipped away at the brittle certainty of ingrained propaganda. The Americans were not beating them, not starving them, not even mocking their vulnerability. Against every expectation, they were treating them with dignity, as fellow human beings. For many women, this was harder to swallow psychologically than the actual food. A potent mix of shame and relief coursed through them with every bite. Tears streamed down their cheeks, shed not just for the hunger eased, but for the profound weight of lies now exposed. In quiet moments, women confessed to each other the utter strangeness of this new reality. One admitted she could no longer conjure the image of a faceless barbarian enemy after witnessing a young GI quietly slip a piece of chocolate to a shivering girl. Another remarked that the bread was so impossibly soft, it felt like cake, a taste she had almost entirely forgotten. They laughed, a bitter, disbelieving sound, at their own astonishment, laughter edged with the sharp pain of years stolen by an unforgiving war. And yet, despite the gnawing shame, the bread kept coming, and they kept eating. At night, as they lay on their straw pallets under rough, military-issue blankets, they whispered low and secretively about the meals. Some clung stubbornly to suspicion, theorizing that perhaps tomorrow the food would cease, or that this strange kindness was merely a temporary illusion. Others, more daring, voiced a fragile, hesitant gratitude. But one question lingered above all, unspoken yet profoundly heavy. Why? Why would these alleged enemies feed them with such astonishing generosity when their own leaders had allowed them to starve? It was a question for which there seemed no easy answer. Perhaps the soldiers were merely following orders. Perhaps it was military practicality. Or perhaps, an almost unthinkable thought, it was simple mercy. Whatever the reason, for women who had long since resigned themselves to a slow death by hunger, this experience was nothing short of transformative. The bread, the coffee, the cornbread, sometimes fried on makeshift stoves, these became potent symbols, not just of immediate survival, but of a world that might, against all odds, exist beyond the pervasive grip of fear. On that somber April day, as the first loaf was broken and the first spoonful swallowed, the women began to grasp that captivity might not mean the starvation and cruelty they had so dreaded. Yet what it would mean, what profound truths it would reveal about their enemies, about themselves, and about the world crumbling around them, that was still to come. And those revelations would surprise them far more profoundly than the miraculous taste of butter melting on soft bread. Mornings in the camp commenced with the distinct clang of metal on metal, the grating sound of pots being dragged across rough, makeshift tables, and the low murmur of soldiers, still half asleep on duty. For the women behind the wire, those noises transformed into a curious kind of clock, more reliable than the sun often hidden behind gray spring clouds. Each specific sound signaled the imminent arrival of food. They would gather in loose, expectant lines, clutching tin cups or whatever battered vessel they had managed to salvage, their eyes fixed intently on the tendrils of steam that curled upward into the damp morning air. Hunger no longer carried the sharp, paralyzing edge of fear. It had transmuted into a ritual, a profound waiting game measured by the comforting scent of coffee and the hopeful sight of fresh bread. The first sip of that black liquid each morning felt like a miraculous return from the dead. It was bitter, strong, and left a lingering, almost metallic tang on the tongue long after the mug was empty. For years, many had sipped concoctions brewed from roasted barley, acorns, or ground-up beets, dubbing it coffee, simply because there was no other word to mask its profound hollowness. Now, real coffee burned its way down their throats, awakening them with a rush of warmth that felt almost indecent in its sheer abundance. Some women closed their eyes as they drank, whispering softly to themselves, as though fearing the soldiers might snatch it away if they dared to admit aloud how utterly precious it was. Bread, too, became a language of its own, unspoken yet universally understood. Thick slices of pristine white loaves, soft enough to tear apart without effort, carried meanings far beyond their mere physical weight. Butter glistened generously on their surfaces, spreading a comforting warmth through bellies shrunken from years of relentless scarcity. One woman, gray-haired and gaunt, pressed her face gently to a slice before eating, as though inhaling its scent was a sacred prayer. Another furtively tucked half her portion under her skirt, intending to save it for later, though she would inevitably break and eat it within the hour, unable to resist its promise. To those who had subsisted on rations measured in mere crumbs, each bite was a fragile miracle, too precious to be postponed. The Americans distributed these meals without ceremony, seemingly unaware of their profound symbolic power. Spam, to the GIs, was an incessant curse, a monotonous staple endlessly joked about in letters home. They complained bitterly about its greasiness, its strange squeak between their teeth, and the inescapable way it seemed to infiltrate every single meal. But across the wire, women who had resorted to gnawing bark to trick their stomachs into silence held that very same spam as though it were an unimaginable treasure from another world. One soldier laughed quietly, almost to himself, watching a young woman painstakingly lick her tin plate clean, then offered her another scoop, shaking his head at the sheer, tragic absurdity of the moment. Numbers, too, told their own stark story, albeit in colder, more clinical tones. By 1945, German civilians often subsisted on barely 1,000 calories a day, a slow, agonizing erosion of both body and spirit. The standard U.S. Army ration, by contrast, was designed to provide more than 3 times that amount. Cans of peaches, powdered eggs, chocolate bars. These were all components of a vast American logistical machine that efficiently fed millions of men across entire oceans. To the women in the camp, however, these figures were not mere abstractions, but living realities written starkly on their own bodies. Slowly, flesh returned to their gaunt cheeks. The deep hollows beneath their eyes softened perceptibly. Even laughter, hesitant and fragile at first, began to reappear, carried on voices that had long forgotten how to sound light and joyous. But a deep current of suspicion never entirely disappeared. Some whispered that the food was a trick, a cruel deception, that one day this ephemeral kindness would end, and the real cruelty would begin. Others spoke of poison, of insidious hidden motives. Yet day after day, the bread arrived, The coffee steamed, the spam gleamed on plates, and the pervasive fear dissolved, slowly but surely, beneath the steady, undeniable rhythm of nourishment. It became impossible to deny the truth of their own bodies, slowly filling out again. Impossible to cling to every lie they had been fed about their enemies when those very enemies placed hot, comforting food directly into their hands. In the evenings, women conversed in low, thoughtful voices about the profound meaning of these meals. One woman declared she had never known bread so incredibly soft, so akin to cake, sweeter even than the treasured birthday confections of her childhood. Another confessed she found the kindness almost unbearable, claiming it shamed her more deeply than hatred ever could. They had been indoctrinated to believe Americans were merciless. Yet here were young men smiling sheepishly as they poured second servings of coffee, muttering softly about home as though the war were already a distant memory. The food was undoing something far deeper than mere physical hunger. It was dismantling belief itself. Still, there were fleeting moments of irony that were simply impossible to ignore. A soldier tried to trade his spam for cigarettes, only to have it politely but firmly refused by his fellow GIs. He then chuckled incredulously when a German woman eagerly asked if she could have it instead, clutching the tin with both hands as though it were unimaginable treasure. "Never thought I'd see the day," he muttered. Another soldier jokingly teased that they were inadvertently turning their prisoners into loyal fans of American cuisine. The women, too absorbed in the act of eating, did not respond, though one smiled faintly, her lips glistening with fat. In those moments, personal memories crystallized into potent, shared symbols. A young girl of 17 recalled biting into canned peaches and weeping uncontrollably because she had utterly forgotten what true sweetness tasted like. An older woman confessed that she had once resorted to stealing food during the worst wartime shortages. Yet here, without judgment, she was given more than she could possibly finish. In these fleeting moments, the brutal conflict that had defined their entire world, the war that had pitted them against the very men now offering them sustenance, seemed less certain, less permanent, almost unreal. Food was, quite literally, dissolving the rigid boundary between enemy and human being. Yet beneath the profound relief, a palpable unease stirred. Why were they being fed so extraordinarily well? Why did their captors treat them with more genuine care than their own leaders had in the dying years of the Reich? The question haunted them, a silent, persistent shadow hovering at the edge of every meal. Gratitude mingled with a bitter resentment, hope with a searing humiliation. To accept the bread was to tacitly admit a profound weakness. To drink the coffee was to taste a truth their propaganda had vehemently denied, that their supposed enemies were, in fact, capable of mercy. Each day's meal transcended mere sustenance. It became a quiet, unspoken negotiation between their fractured past and an uncertain future, between entrenched fear and the fragile possibility of reconciliation. With every sip, every bite, the women crossed an invisible line, a psychological boundary they could never uncross. They began to perceive the soldiers not as faceless, propagandized monsters, but as young men barely older than themselves, weary and undeniably human, with trivial jokes about spam and cherished letters from home tucked into their pockets. And with each realization, the oppressive weight of everything they had been taught about war pressed ever heavier on their shoulders. As April bled into May, and hushed whispers of Germany's imminent surrender seeped through the camp, the women began to grasp that the meals were only the genesis of a much larger shift. Food had filled their empty bellies, but it had also, inadvertently, raised questions far sharper and more profound than any pang of hunger. What else, they wondered, had been a calculated lie? And what would survival truly entail when truth tasted so radically different from everything they had been fed before? The bread had broken their physical hunger. The coffee had warmed their chilled bones. But the true existential shock was yet to come, and it would cut deeper than any hunger they had ever known. The initial shock of being fed gradually normalized into routine, but with that routine emerged questions that cut far deeper than hunger ever could. After meals, the women would sit in small, hushed circles on the ground, their tin plates still holding a vestige of warmth in their laps, quietly attempting to make sense of what was unfolding around them. They had been told that the Americans were savage brutes who would humiliate them, treating them as animals utterly unworthy of respect. Yet here they were, sipping hot coffee, wiping traces of butter from their fingers, and observing young GIs laugh heartily among themselves, much like farm boys at a county fair. The contradiction was too vast, too glaring, to ignore, and every subsequent bite of bread seemed to widen the fracture in the edifice of their former beliefs. Whispers, fragile as tissue paper yet heavy with implication, began to circulate through the camp. Some suggested the food was bait, a cunning trick designed to lower their guard. Others insisted the Americans were simply following orders from some distant general, that this unexpected kindness was merely another weapon in the arsenal of war. But suspicion struggled, increasingly feebly, against the undeniable weight of lived experience. Day after day, the meals arrived, unpoisoned, unpunished, offered with the same almost mechanical generosity. The simple, irrefutable fact that no cruelty followed the bread was harder to dismiss than any impassioned speech from Berlin had ever been. One woman, her hands still rough and chapped from years of labor in a munitions factory, remembered the virulent propaganda slogans that had painted Americans as greedy capitalists who heartlessly starved their own poor. She stared at the soldiers hauling crates of peaches and coffee, a profound wonder in her eyes, daring to whisper aloud if those stories had always been nothing but lies. Another, a farmer's daughter, shook her head, muttering that she absolutely could not afford such dangerous thoughts. Yet even she ate with discernibly less hesitation each morning, her own body betraying her ingrained loyalty to propaganda. Hunger, it seemed, answered questions that ideology could never touch. The Americans themselves seemed faintly amused, or perhaps bewildered, by the reverence their food inspired. A soldier from Iowa recorded in his diary, "The German women treat Spam like caviar. They act as if we're serving them a king's feast, when all we've got are cans and stale crackers." He could not have realized that those very cans contained more calories, more salt, more fat than many of the women had tasted in months, perhaps even years. His casual joke, in fact, represented their salvation. The irony was exquisitely sharp. What he despised as dull monotony, they revered as unimaginable abundance. But beneath this stark irony ran something far more profound. In the simple, repeated act of feeding, a subtle yet seismic transformation was already underway. The women found it increasingly impossible to reconcile the ingrained image of Americans as monstrous brutes with the tangible reality of young men who quietly slipped them chocolate, who smiled sheepishly when offered thanks in broken German or English. For the prisoners, the bread was infinitely more than sustenance. It was incontrovertible evidence that the world was fundamentally not as they had been relentlessly told. For the soldiers, the almost frantic eagerness of their captives to devour what they themselves scorned served as a stark, unsettling reminder of just how much had been utterly annihilated across the ocean. Still, not all moments within the camp were gentle or straightforward. Some women stubbornly refused to eat, clutching their tattered pride more fiercely than their gnawing hunger. They sat rigid, stony-faced, staring at the food until others eventually carried it away. Their defiance, however, was thin armor against a truth they vehemently did not want to face. Yet even many of them eventually yielded, the potent smell of frying meat proving too overwhelming to resist. And when they did, the tears that followed were shed not only for long-alleviated hunger, but for profound, burning shame. To accept bread from the very hands of the enemy was to admit a kind of defeat far more intimate and devastating than any surrender on the battlefield. Records from the Red Cross later confirmed this stark difference in treatment. While American-run camps were often criticized for their sometimes harsh conditions, even in the worst of them, prisoners received food rations that far outstripped what most German civilians had access to in the collapsing Reich. Statistics told a clinical story. thousands of calories per day for prisoners of war versus the meager, near-starvation rations available in bombed-out German cities. Yet within the camp, these cold statistics came vividly alive in the subtle softening of gaunt cheeks, the return of a faint color to pale lips, and the way laughter slowly, tentatively, reappeared after years of oppressive silence. A young soldier, no older than 20, scribbled a letter home to his mother, describing how the German women marveled at cornbread. "They say it tastes like cake," he wrote, "and I couldn't help but laugh. Back home, I'd trade it for your pie any day, but here, it's the sweetest thing they know." His words perfectly encapsulated the poignant absurdity of war's contrasts. What was utterly ordinary in Iowa was a profound miracle on the Rhine. The women, too, recorded their experiences on hidden scraps of paper, though their poignant notes would not reach home for years to come. One meticulously remembered the exact moment butter melted on her tongue, an almost forbidden pleasure. Another confessed her profound shock at the taste of chocolate, its sweetness nearly unbearable after years without sugar. "It felt unreal," she wrote, "as if I had stepped into a dream I was not allowed to have." Their testimonies were small, fragile things, yet each carried the immense weight of a personal revelation. For some, the unexpected kindness of the food sparked a searing guilt. They thought of neighbors still starving amidst the ruins, of children desperately scouring fields for weeds, of old men slowly wasting away in unheated, shattered houses. To be fed so generously by the enemy while their own countrymen suffered such dire deprivation felt like an ultimate betrayal. Yet even this profound guilt could not entirely banish the immense, primal relief of full stomachs. Nor could shame undo the comforting way hot coffee thawed hands that had been perpetually cold for years. The stark contradiction between ingrained expectation and undeniable reality grew sharper, more insistent, with each passing day. The women had braced themselves for outright humiliation and cruelty. Yet the humiliation, when it came, stemmed not from harshness, but from this overwhelming, inexplicable kindness. To be treated better by the enemy than by their own leaders, who had preached sacrifice and offered only starvation, was a wound deeper than any pang of hunger could inflict. Every meal, therefore, posed a silent, agonizing question. If these were the enemy, then who truly had been the betrayer? The answer hovered, unspoken and terrifying, yet it pressed down heavier with each nourishing bite. By May, as insistent rumors of surrender swept through the camp, the entire atmosphere shifted once more. The food no longer appeared to be a temporary kindness, but rather the undeniable beginning of something far larger, far more significant. The women realized they might actually survive this devastating war, not through acts of resistance or unwavering loyalty, but through simple bread handed to them by young men in khaki. Their future remained profoundly uncertain, their shame heavy and persistent, yet their bellies were full. And in that simple fullness lay a truth they could no longer escape. Their captives were not the monsters they had been told to fear, but something far more complicated, far more human. The meals themselves had become tentative yet undeniable bridges between two worlds that had been thoroughly indoctrinated only to hate. And though no one articulated it aloud, both sides felt the increasing, undeniable weight of that bridge growing stronger with each passing day. The Americans wondered what unpredictable outcomes would arise from feeding those who had so recently been their sworn enemies. The Germans, in turn, grappled with what it truly meant to owe their very survival to men they had been ceaselessly told were less than human. The world, it seemed, was rewriting its own rules, one meal at a time. A lingering question, sharper than any hunger and heavier than the densest bread, settled with each meal. If their sworn enemy could extend mercy, what profound implications did that hold for every belief they had ever cherished? And what, in turn, would such unexpected mercy demand of them? Germany's surrender arrived not in a blaze of fireworks or a moment of definitive clarity, but through hushed whispers filtering through camp fences, fragmented snippets from overheard radio broadcasts, and the subtle, yet perceptible, shift in the demeanor of their American guards. On May 8, 1945, the roar of the guns finally ceased. Yet within the compound, the true symbol of this monumental transformation wasn't the silence of artillery, but the tangible presence of bread. That morning, the women lined up as they always had, their empty cups rattling in their anxious hands, and were served as if the world had not just fundamentally changed. The war, a monstrous behemoth, had indeed ended. Still, the coffee steamed with familiar warmth. The cornbread crumbled softly in their fingers. The Spam, a ubiquitous wartime staple, glistened under the pale morning sun. For many, this startling continuity, this mundane act of feeding, proved more disorienting than the news of surrender itself. A heavy realization settled deep within their stomachs. Survival was not destined to end with defeat. The enemy, who possessed every reason to exact vengeance, had instead chosen sustenance. One woman, clutching her modest slice of bread, murmured with an aching irony that it was the first time she had ever felt truly full on the very day her country fell. The paradox bit deeper than any hunger she had known. What could it possibly mean to taste such mercy while everything else around them crumbled into ruin? Each meal, therefore, became imbued with layers of profound symbolism. The bread was no longer merely bread. It was undeniable proof that mercy could genuinely exist in the very spaces where hate had been so meticulously cultivated. The coffee transcended its simple function. It offered warmth, a counterpoint to the chilling propaganda that had promised only relentless cruelty. Even Spam, that greasy, oft-mocked ration of soldiers, transformed into a paradoxical sacrament, subtly uniting victor and vanquished in the raw, absurd necessity of shared human need. In the simple act of eating, these women were compelled to confront and accept not only the unexpected kindness of their captors, but also the unsettling betrayal of the very lies they had once held dear. The Americans, for their part, began to grasp, however dimly, that food was performing a transformative work far beyond the capabilities of any speech or political rhetoric. One officer noted in a report that feeding prisoners consistently cut down on unrest, a utilitarian observation. Yet, beneath this practical logic, something profoundly more human was quietly taking root. Soldiers who had fully expected to despise their captives found their resolve softening as they witnessed gaunt women gradually regain color in their pallid cheeks. A private, writing home, confessed, "The Germans don't look like enemies when they're laughing over chocolate." His unassuming words inadvertently revealed a quiet truth. War, in its brutal efficiency, had failed to completely strip away their shared humanity. Nevertheless, this newfound kindness was not devoid of tension. Gratitude, an emotion they hadn't anticipated, often carried with it the bitter sting of humiliation. Women who had once cheered boisterously at victory parades now found themselves weeping silently over bread bestowed by those they had been relentlessly taught to fear. Their pride, a fragile shield, cracked with every bite, leaving them suspended precariously between the overwhelming relief of survival and the crushing weight of shame. Some, unable to bear the psychological strain, broke down, confessing to one another their inability to discern what to believe anymore. Others hardened their resolve, defiantly insisting that the food was nothing more than a calculated tactic, a means to soften them for eventual exploitation. But with each passing day, hunger inevitably returned, and each day, the bread and coffee silenced every internal argument more powerfully than any spoken words ever could. Stories began to emerge from the camps, recollections that would resonate for decades to come. One woman vividly recalled her first chocolate bar as a revelation so utterly overwhelming that she meticulously rationed it crumb by precious crumb, making it last for days. Another tearfully remembered butter melting into warm bread, admitting she wept not only for the forgotten taste but for the ghost of her long-dead mother, who used to bake loaves in a farmhouse now reduced to rubble. These were not grand, politically charged narratives. Rather, They were profoundly human, visceral proof that the ravages of war could never truly strip memory from taste. The meals, in their simple generosity, became an unexpected bridge across a chasm of grief, gently binding the shattered past to a future that seemed impossibly fragile. As weeks slowly stretched into months, the food distributed in those internment camps began to foreshadow a far larger story, one that would soon reshape an entire continent. Long before the ambitious Marshall Plan, before the drafting of treaties and the initiation of large-scale reconstruction efforts, there was basic nourishment, tangible, simple proof that rebuilding in any form might indeed be possible. Food had, in effect, become the earliest form of diplomacy. American cornbread, coffee, and canned peaches spoke more eloquently and convincingly than any general's speech. They conveyed to a defeated populace that survival was within reach, that mercy could be extended, even to those who had once been labeled absolute enemies. The women themselves underwent a profound transformation beneath the cumulative weight of this truth. Their bodies, once skeletal and ravaged, slowly began to recover. Cheeks filled out, eyes regained their spark, and even laughter, tentative at first, but undeniably real, returned. More shocking than their physical survival was the radical shift in their perception. They no longer looked at the guards solely with fear, but with something akin to recognition. These young men in khaki were not faceless monsters. They were tired, undeniably human, sometimes kind, occasionally clumsy, and even, at times, capable of a joke. To admit this new reality was both a profound comfort and a gnawing wound, for it unequivocally meant that the world had never been as simple or as black and white as they had been told. For some, this unsettling realization ignited a bitterness even sharper than hunger itself. They questioned why their own leaders had allowed them to starve while their captors now provided sustenance. They wondered, though such inquiries were rarely voiced aloud, who had truly been their enemy all along. To harbor such dangerous questions, even in the merest whisper, was perilous, yet the bread relentlessly demanded it. Every slice was both an act of mercy and a silent, damning accusation, pointing with unsettling clarity toward the hollowness of everything they had been promised. In due course, many women would look back on those meals as the pivotal moment they began to truly understand the profound fragility of hatred. Decades later, survivors interviewed in their old age would recall not grand battles or powerful speeches, but the astonishing shock of American food. "It was then I knew we had been lied to," one woman confessed softly, "because the enemy was feeding me better than my own people had." Another, her smile tinged with an enduring sorrow, vividly remembered her first taste of chocolate. "I thought heaven had dropped a piece of itself into my hands," she mused. These testimonies, fragile and precious with the passage of time, held a weight far exceeding any statistics. They revealed how survival had been inextricably braided with truth, and how the simplest acts of mercy possessed the power to unravel even the most entrenched and venomous lies. For the Americans, too, the act of feeding their former enemies left an indelible mark. Many soldiers returned home carrying vivid stories of prisoners who clutched bread as if it were priceless treasure, who wept openly over a simple cup of coffee, who regarded spam as an unexpected delicacy. They never forgot these stark contrasts. For them, victory was no longer solely measured in battles won or territories conquered, but in the profound experience of seeing their enemies humanized through the crucible of hunger and the subsequent relief. The sheer absurdity of war had never been clearer. The very same chocolate bar that could be disdained in a barracks might be cherished beyond measure in a prison camp. By the summer of 1945, the women no longer trembled in anticipation at mealtime. The gnawing pangs of physical hunger had largely been eased, yet a deeper, more profound conflict lingered within their souls. To accept the food was to accept the unsettling truth that mercy was indeed possible, that the enemy could, in fact, be human, and that the world might demand a fundamentally different way of thinking from them. Each meal subtly carved away the brittle certainty of old loyalties, leaving them standing on increasingly uncertain ground. And yet, For all the comforting softness of bread and the soothing warmth of coffee, a larger, more daunting truth loomed just beyond their immediate experience. Kindness, they knew, was not the ultimate conclusion of their story. Beyond the fences of their camp, momentous decisions were being made concerning Germany's future, decisions about occupation and justice, about punishment, and, eventually, about rebuilding. The women sensed this shift in the way the guards grew quieter, in the altered contents of arriving supply crates, in the way rumors of trials and tribunals now replaced the earlier whispers of surrender. The food had undeniably shown them mercy, but what that mercy truly signified in the long, unforgiving shadow of defeat remained a haunting, unanswered question. The bread had indeed filled their bellies. The coffee had thawed their chilled bones. The chocolate had rekindled forgotten laughter. But none of these could shield them from the agonizing question that grew sharper and more urgent with every passing day. If mercy could be tasted here, what unfathomable cost would survival demand of them tomorrow?